In 2023, Ryan O'Hearn had one of the most surprising breakout seasons in all of Major League Baseball. But did he follow it up by doing enough in 2024 for the Orioles to keep him around long term? I'll try to answer that question by reviewing O'Hearn's 2024 season, coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Tuesday, October 29th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, we are going to continue our Orioles Player 2024 season review series as we break down the season for Ryan O'Hearn, his second in an Orioles uniform. He wasn't a breakout star anymore. Teams knew who he was, and he still contributed offensively, but did it in a completely different way this year. Gone were the gaudy hard hit numbers, and in were the walks and the contact. It all adds up to, did he do enough to stick around? Will the O's pick up his club option for 2025? Could he be around beyond that? We'll get to all that and more coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Prize Picks. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB to win $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. That's at Prize Picks. Run your game. So we continue our season review series for each Orioles player on the 40-man roster. And today we talk about Ryan O'Hearn. Just a refresher, or if you haven't checked out any of our player review episodes so far this offseason, we split it into three segments: what went right for the player in 2024, what went wrong for the player, and then we talk about what their biggest storyline is heading into the offseason and into 2025. And with Ryan O'Hearn, we begin with what went right. And the big, most noticeable thing for Ryan O'Hearn in 2024 was that he cut way down on his strikeout rate. It was quite impressive to see what he did strikeout rate wise. I mean, it is hard to cut your strikeouts at all, especially with how prevalent strikeouts are today in the game of Major League Baseball. It is even harder to cut your K rate by over 8%. He was at 22.3% strikeout rate last year. Not terrible, kind of middle of the pack. He cut it to 14% in 2024. To put 14% in perspective, among batters who had at least 450 plate appearances in the big leagues this year, O'Hearn's strikeout rate of 14% was the 13th lowest in all of Major League Baseball, including being the lowest one on the Orioles. Here are some players who are known for their ability to make contact, put the ball in play, and also be good hitters. Ryan O'Hearn had a lower strikeout rate than all of these guys: Bobby Witt Jr., Jeff McNeil, Yordan Alvarez, Yandy Diaz, Freddie Freeman, and Marcus Semien, just to name a few. Those are all good players who are known for their ability to avoid strikeouts, and O'Hearn did it better than any of them this season. That is really, really impressive, and he did that along with doubling his walk rate. It is one thing to say, I'm going to cut down on my strikeouts this year, but sometimes guys will just turn into contact first players. They'll become some sort of version of Luis Arraez, where, yeah, you're not striking out, but you're also not walking, and you're kind of swinging at pitches out of the zone. And although you don't swing and miss at them, it leads to some soft contact sometimes. No. O'Hearn had a really bad walk rate last year. He walked just 4.1% of the time. That was in the bottom 5 percentile in Major League Baseball. He upped his walk rate to 9.3%, which got him to the point where he was not drawing any walks to this year. Hey, he was drawing walks at a better than average rate to go along with an elite strikeout rate. That is a fantastic combination to have. And that is what O'Hearn had this year: lowest strikeout rate and second highest walk rate in this Orioles lineup. That is a fantastic combination for a guy who can still hit the ball out of the ballpark. He still did put together a career high 15 home runs this season as well. Let's just take a look at his full line on the year. Played in 142 games for the Orioles, 494 plate appearances. He had 15 home runs. He drove in 59 runs. to go along with 21 doubles as well. O'Hearn hit 264 with a 334 on base and a 427 slugging percentage. I mentioned the strikeouts and the walks. That was good for a 119 WRC plus and a 1.7 WAR according to FanGraphs. Both of those were career highs as well. And that's where it really gets interesting for Ryan O'Hearn. I mean, cutting down the strikeouts, cut down his swing and miss rate from 23% to 18%, 18% swing and miss rate. That's in the top echelon of Major League Baseball as well. And it really kind of gets you to the point where you're like, okay, you can do all that, but how do you do that? Now, I tried to put together an episode that was similar to this earlier in the season, where we basically talked about, okay, what was Ryan O'Hearn doing differently? Because he got off to a really, really good start this year, and he was really just cutting his strikeouts from the beginning of the year. But how do you do what he did, which is his strikeout rate had the third largest drop year to year of any player in Major League Baseball. Only Connor Wong of the Red Sox and Brenton Doyle of the Rockies had a larger drop in their strikeout rate between 2023 and 2024. So how do you do something like that? Well, the big thing for O'Hearn was, first of all, he was just swinging at less pitches outside the strike zone. He cut his chase rate from 30% to 26%. That got him better than league average with that cut. That is a huge thing, to just swing at less pitches out of the strike zone. You're going to strike out less if you do that, if you're a guy who's already good at making solid contact. But last year, his big issue was you could really get him to swing and miss up in the zone, especially up and in. I'm going to show you a chart right now. If you're watching on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel, of course, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the page. But this is a chart from 2023, and it shows all the zones, the strike zone, then slightly out of the zone, and the swing and miss percentage for Ryan O'Hearn in those zones. As you can see, pitches up and in, he had a little bit of struggle with 28% on pitches up and in 2023 was his swing and miss rate. Not great. Now, he's not a guy who swings and misses a whole bunch anyway, but look what he did to 2024. Now switching over to the 2024 chart, and you can see, cut that up and in strikeout swing and miss rate to just 18%. Now, down and in was still a problem for him, but if you look in the strike zone, he's barely swinging and missing, especially up and in. He was able to adjust his hands and his swing a little bit to get to that usually fastball, whether it's from a lefty or more likely a righty, because he's not going to see a lot of lefties because the Orioles kind of game plan him that way. But those up and in pitches, he chopped that whiff rate by a lot this year. And in doing that, he made more contact. Now, he didn't have a lot more production on those pitches. That up and in zone I talked about where he cut his whiff rate, he was hitting like 0.90 on those pitches last year. He hit about 180 on those pitches this year. So he's doubling his batting average. I mean, that's great. He's doing more production, but he's still hitting sub 200 on those pitches in that area. It's not like he's crushing the ball, but what he's doing now is he really just fouled them off a whole lot more. Or maybe he would fly out, or maybe he could, dunk a single into left field on that pitch instead of swinging and missing so often. But at the very least, he was just getting a lot more foul balls on those pitches up and in. It allowed him to stay alive and get a better pitch. And the other thing he did, he just swung less in those zones. Pitches up in the strike zone and pitches up and in that were out of the strike zone, he swung less, which also led to the up in walks this year. And with him either laying off that pitch or being able to foul that pitch off, which he did both of this year, pitchers started to try and find other ways to get him out. And when they started to do that, there wasn't as big of a hole in his swing up and in. They were more likely to make mistakes in other parts of the zone where O'Hearn could do damage, or O'Hearn just became much more likely to draw a walk this year, which obviously showed up in his statistics. And you look at that in terms of his swing and miss rate versus fastballs. He was whiffing 19% of the time against fastballs last year. That's still solid. He cut that to 11% this year. So it wasn't just up and in fastballs. It's all fastballs. He's making more contact, putting the ball in play and putting the pressure on defenses, putting the pressure on opposing pitchers. There's not as big a hole in his swing. And it was really interesting to see him throughout the year continue to make those adjustments. Now, the other thing is for O'Hearn, and this is what we saw in 2023 as well, he continued to come through in the big moments. He was having those great at-bats where he was fouling off pitches or maybe drawing walks. Like, He had a hit and a walk in the wild card series. Not a lot of Orioles could say that. And also, he hit 279 with a 114 WRC plus with runners in scoring position this year. Now, he got worse in the second half, like pretty much the entire Orioles team did, but he was still a productive hitter in those spots. And the big thing for O'Hearn is because he had the lowest strikeout rate on the team. Remember, the Orioles are one of the worst teams in baseball this year when it came to striking out with runners in scoring position. You know, they weren't getting the hits, but they also weren't getting the RBI groundouts or the sac flies to at least bring in runs. O'Hearn was a guy who could do that because his strikeout rate was cut and he could come up with hits with runners in scoring position. And the other great thing he did again this year was pinch hit. I mean, we'll get to it in the second segment. He still was not really playing against left-handed pitchers. He's got a few more chances against them this year, but you know, if there was a lefty on the mound, O'Hearn generally was not going to be in the starting lineup. So that meant when a righty came out of the bullpen, O'Hearn became a very dangerous pinch hitter. We saw it all of last year, and we really saw it all of this year as well. Remember, he pinch hit in the ninth inning of game one of the wild card series, drew a leadoff walk with the Orioles down 1-0. Of course, they couldn't score him, but he got that rally started. O'Hearn in the regular season went 7 for 18. That is a 389 batting average as a pinch hitter. He also drew a chunk of walks as well. O'Hearn had a 226 WRC plus as a pinch hitter this year. He was statistically among guys who had at least 20 pinch hit plate appearances this year. O'Hearn was the third best pinch hitter in Major League Baseball this season. And that kind of makes his role moving forward interesting because we'll see if the Orioles do choose to bring him back next year, and I hope they do, and I'll talk about that more later as well. But even if the bat drops off a little bit, it feels like he still has value, even if he becomes maybe a little more of a bench player than he has been the last 2 years, because he's so good and so well prepared when he comes into the game as a pinch hitter. And really the other great thing he does is just he is one of the veteran leaders in the clubhouse. Now, again, it was only his second year with the Orioles, but that's the same thing for James McCann. And James McCann was one of the top veteran leaders in this Orioles clubhouse. He's a guy who's been around a lot with the Royals, been through a lot of struggles in his career, of course, kind of found everything with the Orioles in 2023. He's very well respected in there. And among the clubhouse doesn't have a whole lot of respected veterans. He is an important one in there, and it combines to make him just a popular and important player for this Orioles team. But that is not to say that everything went right for Ryan O'Hearn this year. Some things were certainly different in his offensive profile. He was better at some things, but overall his output offensively was very similar to 2023. So that means he also got worse at some other things at the plate. We'll talk about what those were coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So as we talk about the changes that Ryan O'Hearn made in 2024, a lot of things went right. Up the walk rate, knocked down the strikeout rate, had a bit of a different approach, was still clutch in the moment. But there were also things that went wrong. And really, the quality of contact for Ryan O'Hearn just was not the same. Most guys who cut their strikeout rate also end up cutting their hard hit rate. Because if you're striking out less, you're making more contact. And just because of that in general, when you're making a larger range of contact, a smaller percentage of it, just because of how math works, is going to be super hard quality contact. And you see this a lot. I talked about with guys like Luis Ariz, right? They hit the ball everywhere, but they don't hit the ball hard all the time because they're just trying to put the ball in play. You need to be truly elite to have a low strikeout rate and a high hard hit percentage. A guy like Yordan Alvarez of the Astros is someone who falls into that category. Now, O'Hearn last year was a hard hit monster. It was the reason really he broke out onto the scene, was just crushing baseballs. A 51.5% hard hit rate for Ryan O'Hearn in 2023 was the 16th best in all of Major League Baseball. Gunnar Henderson was the only Oriole who hit the ball harder than O'Hearn last year. He, in the Major League rankings, was one spot behind some guy named Mike Trout in terms of hard hit percentage last year. That's how good O'Hearn was in that statistic. And it did lead to a good amount of hits because generally hard hit balls with an exit velocity of 95 miles per hour or more tend to do. But he dropped a good amount this year. He dropped down to a 40.1% hard hit rate in 2024. So he went to, a top 20 hitter in terms of hard hit rate last year to 40%. I mean, that's basically middle of the pack in the league. Like, it's not considered bad, not considered good. It's just right around the middle of the pack. And that is what he fell to. And that was really the trade-off for O'Hearn this season. And it's kind of wild to think about because I mentioned his decrease in strikeout rate. It was the third largest decrease in strikeout rate from 2023 to 2024 of any players in Major League Baseball. As I mentioned, only 2 players had a larger decrease in K rate. But he gave some things up. Ryan O'Hearn had the largest drop of hard hit rate among all qualified hitters in Major League Baseball from 2023 to 2024. He dropped 11.4% of hard hit rate. Right behind him, Spencer Torkelson, Max Kepler, Brandon Drury, Nolan Gorman. But nobody dropped off in hard hit rate as much as Ryan O'Hearn. Now, he had the highest hard hit rate to start with of all of those guys. But it's very intriguing to see what happens to a player when they're not hitting the ball as hard. You look at the guy right behind him, Spencer Torkelson of the Tigers, went from 51% to about 40%. But he still struck out a ton. And because of that, Torkelson spent a good chunk of this season in AAA because he was struggling so much at the plate. For O'Hearn, even though he made that dropout, he dropped the K rate tremendously, walked more, and ended up being, as I mentioned, he had a 118 WRC plus in 2023. He had a 119 WRC plus in 2024. So at least compared to the rest of the league, he was production-wise a very similar hitter. He just did it in a very, very different way. His barrel rate, his average exit velocity all went down. It meant the power was down across the board. He went from a 480 slugging percentage last year to a 427 slugging percentage this year. And I mean, even the batting average went down. Even though he's putting the ball in play more, he went from 289 to 264 on his batting average this year. But the interesting thing was, even though the surface stats went down and, that one of those top underlying stats we're looking at, the hard hit rate, went way down. Again, it dropped more than anybody in baseball from year to year. His expected stats by StatCast, which take into account how hard you hit the ball, your quality of contact, are you squaring the ball up? Where are you hitting the ball in terms of the launch angle and where on the field it goes? All of that stuff. The expected stats actually went up for Ryan O'Hearn, despite everything telling us they should have gone down, right? Because if you are hitting the ball way less hard, generally that means your expected stats are going to go down too. But they did not. Last year, he had a 264 expected batting average. It was up at 280 this year. Last year, at a 464 expected slugging. It was at 467 this year. So even though a lot of the stats in terms of the big time production look worse, and the overall production looks very similar, just doing it in a different way, I'm going to say that Ryan O'Hearn had a better offensive season this year than he did last year. And that's because he was aided by some good luck last year. He had a lot of bad luck this year. With better luck, if his stats were closer to the expected and you add in the ability to not strike out and walk a good amount, that's a great hitter right there. He would have easily been much, much better than he was in 2023. And kind of all of this shows up in his ability to hit off-speed pitches. So StatCast, they combine basically changeups and splitters to call them off-speed pitches. This year, he hit 188 against off-speeds. Last year, he hit 277. That is a gigantic drop-off in how well he's hitting off-speeds. But if you look into the expected batting average, his expected batting average 40 points higher this year against off speeds with a better average exit velocity as well. So there are still places where he is squaring the ball up, he is hitting the ball hard, he is making good contact. He's just making more contact in general. So that's going to bring down, just statistically, his overall hard hit rate. But he's giving himself way more bites at the apple by not striking out, by walking, by putting the ball in play. And that is allowing the expected stats to go up while the surface stats kind of still say the same. What that all tells me is if he can keep this up, he could have his best year next year. And we'll get to that in a moment. And I know that felt like, well, Connor, isn't this the what went wrong section? Wasn't that something that went right? Well, yeah, but it still ended up with a lower slugging percentage and a lower batting average and all that good stuff. The other part about what went wrong is he didn't really finish strong. Now, this is nothing new for a 2024 Baltimore Oriole. I think we all know that most of the players in this lineup did not finish strong. He wasn't as bad as some other Orioles. He was basically a league average hitter in August and September. Some guys got much worse than that down the stretch. But his strikeout rate, which again, he had dropped all the way to 14%, was back up to 21% in the month of September. His walk rate was down to 7%. He had his lowest hard hit rate in September. He kind of felt like he just ran out of gas. I mean, he still played even more. He had more than 100 more plate appearances this year than he had last year and set a career high for playing time in 2024. He just was not the same hitter in September. So certainly something to monitor. And the other thing was, he's still not being used against left-handed pitchers. Now, you could argue whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. I would argue that a good chunk of O'Hearn's success since coming over to the Orioles is that the O's have just said, you don't need to worry about lefties. We are rarely going to put you in there against a left-handed pitcher. Just worry about those platoon splits and hitting righties. You know, he had 29 plate appearances, all of 2023 against lefties, hit 192. He did have 2 homers. This year, got a little more just because he played more. He had 44 plate appearances against lefties out of 494 total plate appearances. Now, he did hit 262 against lefties, but only 2 of those hits were extra base hits. It was basically just some flare singles. His strikeout rate was still down at 16%, so he still definitely stayed in there against lefties, but he wasn't making anything close to quality contact against left-handers. He didn't look amazingly comfortable still against those lefties. And so I'm still fine with that role kind of being not really facing left-handers. And the last thing is defense is still not really his strong suit. He did play outfield this year. And honestly, when you look at the outs above average and the fielding run value by StatCast, like he wasn't bad in the outfield. I think he was honestly a little more trustworthy when I watched him in the outfield this year than he was at times last year when he kind of looked like a disaster out there. I mean, he played 158 innings in the outfield this year and had a 0 outs above average. So basically they thought, hey, he was a league average guy when he was out there. And you will take that for a guy who's kind of playing out of position. The issue was all of his statistics went way down at first base this year. That is clearly much more his normal position. Now, I think if you were to pencil him in for anything, you'd pencil him in as the Orioles DH this season, but he still did play about 400 innings at first base, and he put that together for a -2 outs above average after being +4 last year. So that was certainly something, and I will tell you, especially because Mountcastle was so good, and Mountcastle is a Gold Glove finalist at first base, Mountcastle played most of the inning, but when Mountcastle was out and O'Hearn was in there at first base, you could clearly see the difference between those two defensively. O'Hearn just not as sure-handed over there at first base. So you combine all of that, and now the Orioles have a decision to make because Ryan O'Hearn has a club option. The team gets to decide whether or not they want to bring him back in 2025. The question is, will they do it? Try to answer that to finish off the pod coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the best place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, Prize Picks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to all. How do you play it? Well, all you do is just pick more or less on at least 2 players for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. You can run your game all season long at Prize Picks. They've got all the sports. They've got baseball, they've got football, they've got basketball, they've got hockey. And again, you're just taking more or less. You get a stat line sent to you, might be Justin Jefferson receiving yards, something like more or less than 83.5. I'm always going to take more because that is my man on my fantasy team, Justin Jefferson. But you just take more or less. And if they get more and you take more, you're on your way to winning money. It is that easy. You can make a lineup in like a minute. So download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, download the app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. And that is at Prize Picks. Run your game. So as we finish up here talking about Ryan O'Hearn and his 2024 season with the Orioles, we end with what is his biggest storyline heading into the offseason and then into 2025. And the biggest storyline is, will the Orioles bring him back? That is the number one question, because when the Orioles went to arbitration last offseason with Ryan O'Hearn, they tacked on potentially one extra year. He was initially set to become a free agent after 2024, but they tacked on a club option onto his contract. It is a $8 million club option. What does that mean? The Orioles, after the World Series, they will basically have a week or so to decide whether or not they would want to bring back Ryan O'Hearn on a 1-year, $8 million deal next year. If they exercise the club option, he'll be back. He'll get paid $8 million. If they decline it, he'll become a free agent. Now, they could certainly work out a separate, cheaper or whatever it may be deal to bring him back, but they have the chance to basically lock him up before he becomes available to any other team in free agency. And first things first is, I would absolutely pick up that $8 million option and bring O'Hearn back for at least one more year, especially if the Orioles don't think it's a guarantee that they can re-sign Anthony Santander. Because I know O'Hearn is not the most trustworthy defensive outfielder, and Heston Kjerstad is a maybe a little more natural replacement in right field for Santander. But if you lose Santander, you're going to need a productive guy who can at least fill those parts of the lineup. And O'Hearn is 1 year, $8 million is so cheap for a guy who produced 19% better than league average as a hitter this year and can hold his own in the field. That, to me, especially with David Rubenstein now in charge, that is an easy yes. Even if you don't know how long a term Ryan O'Hearn is for this Orioles roster, $8 million is such a small amount to these baseball teams and to David Rubenstein. It seems like a no-brainer to pick up that option. And I know he changed as a hitter. He went from the big EVs power guy to, the cut the strikeouts, put the ball in play, walk guy. But it still worked to make him a productive hitter. And I get that you're not really still going to play him against lefties. He's going to sit on the bench against left-handers. But you see way more righties than you do lefties. The Orioles did that this year, and he still had just shy of 500 plate appearances. That is a guy who's in your lineup most days. And to put 1 year, $8 million in perspective, that is the exact contract that Whit Merrifield got last offseason. Whit Merrifield probably is not going to get a major league deal this offseason. Like, I think he's run his course in his Major League Baseball career. Ryan O'Hearn, to me, is a much better player. You could argue that, at least a much better hitter than Whit Merrifield. I think 1 year, $8 million would be a steal to bring O'Hearn back. And then the other question is, if you do bring him back, okay, what kind of hitter is he going to be? Having that exit velocity monster 2 years ago was amazing, but this year he still produced just the same in a different way. And this is something I talked about a lot shortly after the season ended. The Orioles offense flopped down the stretch. It was terrible with runners in scoring position. It just kind of became a mess. I talked about how I don't think the O's will do any kind of sweeping offensive changes heading into 2025, but I did talk about how I felt like they needed a little more variance in their offense, maybe a different kind of bat, guys who are not these huge EV home run hitter types, the guys who more are going to put the ball in play a little bit, to get on base maybe a little bit more for the guys who can hit the ball out of the ballpark. And Ryan O'Hearn wasn't billed as that kind of guy, but kind of turned himself into that kind of hitter this year. And I find it so fascinating that he did that. I do want to hear more, maybe we can this offseason, about how purposeful this was of a change for O'Hearn, or maybe something happened and then he felt like he was forced to go this direction with his game. I'm really intrigued to know if this was like his plan put in place, knowing that there wasn't as many hitters that profiled like that in this Orioles lineup, and they might need someone who can get on base more and doesn't strike out and draws his walks and puts the ball in play. I think the O's need more of that in their lineup to make it just a little more balanced. So to me, to bring that back for $8 million is, again, a no-brainer. a guy who can avoid strikeouts, especially with runners in scoring position. You can avoid the problems that the Orioles had. I think just taking him out of this lineup, especially with the questions about Santander and his future with the O's, I think that would be a large mistake. And I would honestly have him keep down this path of what he did as a hitter in 2024. Keep up doing that to avoid the strikeouts, get the walks, and put the ball in play. That's a great combination in this Orioles lineup. And the question then becomes, okay, what's his playing time? That has a lot to do with, is Anthony Santander in an Orioles uniform? Is Ryan Mountcastle still in an Orioles uniform? Do the O's add another hitter in free agency via trade who's going to be an everyday player to maybe get another veteran in this lineup after seeing how it crumbled really for this team down the stretch? But even if they did, trade Mountcastle for a pitcher, I think the O's would try to slide Kobe Mayo into that right-handed hitting first baseman position next year, but O'Hearn would still have his spot. And again, if they do let Santander walk or they just get outbid for Santander, I do think the Orioles will sign another hitter to try and replace him. But I think they will sign more of a right-handed outfield bat. I don't think that really steps in to O'Hearn more of a left-handed first base bat. I don't think that would cut into any of his playing time. I still think it would be more at DH than it is, in the outfield or at first base for O'Hearn, but his at-bats are still going to be there. And again, even if you're not playing him against lefties, which I wouldn't, there is a role for a guy. And at $8 million, that is nothing. And you know what? If we get to July of next year and it turns out it was all smoke and mirrors and O'Hearn looks like, for some reason, the hitter he was back in Kansas City, a 1-year, $8 million commitment is not a lot to let go of. Or if you just feel like he's a great leader in the clubhouse, you keep him around for the rest of the season and then you don't bring him back for 2026 and beyond. But right now, he is a very important piece to this lineup, to this clubhouse. Again, I talked about last week, we talked about Seranthony Dominguez. I called that a no-brainer to bring him back for 1 year, $8 million. I think O'Hearn for 1 year, $8 million is an even easier decision. Just do it. Know he's back in this lineup, and we go from there as a guy. Hey, when he comes to the plate, I trust Ryan O'Hearn to get things done, and I think that will continue into 2025. That'll do it for today's episode. Hope you enjoyed that one. We will be back tomorrow with another episode. I will say, let's go Dodgers in World Series Game 4 tonight. Unless we get some big Orioles news, I'll continue with these Orioles players' season reviews for 2024 on tomorrow's episode. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.